traditional bottom-up approach theory and the role of religion in conflict transformation in Myanmar, that's a long topic. I want to acknowledge that this is not a blueprint for conflict transformation, but one way to look at how this might be an alternative in the context of Myanmar. I'll walk through Myanmar country profile real quick. The official name is the Republic of the Union of Myanmar, and the capital is Naypyidaw. And the population is 53 million, and it's basically between China and India. It's kind of a sandwich country. There are 5 recognized, government-recognized religions such as Buddhism, Christian, Islam, Hindu, and animist. So there's the latest religion data that we have from 2014 census. So I'd like to talk about the role of religion in Myanmar's state affairs. Since the founding of the Burma Kingdom, religion has played a significant role, which is to say the Buddhist institutions such as monasteries. And this kind of influence, the religious influence over the state affair pattern continue to shape the post-colonial, which is up to 1944 Myanmar states. And the conflict situation in Myanmar is very complex, and it's a combination of religious ideology and ethnic conflict. So, today I want to focus on the religious side of conflict and how the top-down approach, peace-building style in Myanmar has failed. Like, for example, the United Nations Population Fund had funded the 2014 census despite the global NGOs and human rights groups arguing that this census could have a huge negative impact on the ethnic minority groups such as Rohingya. And that census led to the exclusion of Rohingya minority groups and leading up to their genocide, genocidal persecution in 2017. So also, like, Commission, Kofi Annan Foundation Commission was invited to do a commission, but I want to emphasize that this is just two kind of example. Their approach is very much in a top-down style. It's just like some people, they didn't really even go to the conflict zone, but in the capital or in the Thailand or Hong Kong, sitting in the office and doesn't really know what's happening on the ground. So that contributed to nothing more than just an activity. So I felt that sometimes that our Western funded organizations is not really helpful. Like Western taxpayers' money are went to the wrong place instead. So my argument is the bottom-up approach could be the alternative one, because bottom-up approach theory style of conflict transformation implements global level dialogue and even the role of women and spiritual or theological aspects of conflict, which is really important in the conflict. In the conflict between the Muslims and the Buddhist communities, especially in the Rakhine states of Western Myanmar, the rhetorical, theological aspect is really important, because the Buddhist communities felt threatened that Myanmar will be overtaken by Muslim, in few years. So that kind of public discourse has influenced the local level. They are the main actor. They are the main stakeholders. But these stakeholders are oftentimes dismissed by the top-down approach, peace-building style. So like secularists or kind of trying to install liberal democracy style, and not knowing what's happening in the ground, the religious aspect of the conflict. So,
okay. 2 minutes.
Oh, okay, cool. I'm on track. So, just in conclusion, I want to I argue that the top-down approach of conflict transformation styles ends up in a zero sum, which means for one to win, another has to lose. But bottom-up approach leads to a win-win solution for both parties. So in the country, in societies, in a deeply divided and religious society like Myanmar, conflict transformation from the bottom up would likely result in a positive peacekeeping. That's my argument. And religion as an organized institution has a powerful force to mobilize people as much as for peace and conflicts. So therefore, any attempts that for intervention in conflict transformation should pay attention to like this bottom-up theory approach in the conflict transformation rather than top-down. And yeah, the reason it is continuing. This pattern is continuing even up to the 2021 military coup. Like the Myanmar Institute for Peace and Security, that's a think tank organization, was then funded think tank, like released a report in favor of like the military regime. That's ridiculous. Ridiculous. So yeah, that's really sad to see such kind of outcome. Yeah, that's it. Thank you for listening.
Someone hasn't asked a question yet?
Nope.
I'm just full of them.
I had a question about what you think the bottom-up approach would look like.
As far as my experience is concerned, local level, I think local level community integration or engagement between like the Buddhists and the Muslims or Christians and Muslims would be helpful. I don't have any kind of experience those systems. Instead, like it would be just the top-to-top officials meeting and decide things which sometimes are exotic to the grassroots people.
How did the religion and conflict transformation program and your connections with it in courses and so forth, how has that impacted your understanding of what's going on in Myanmar?
Yeah, that's an outstanding question. Thank you. Actually, I came here for this. Like this program is one of my my interests that led me to USTH, and growing up in a country that suffer decades-long conflict, and which is also motivated by religious ideology. I think this program has helped me understand a lot, like how religious ideology could be used as a force, even a moral force to transform conflict in a better way, not only to mobilize conflict, but to transform conflict to a peace and just society.
everyone, and I'm a fourth year English study student. So in 2005, I moved to rural Alaska where I lived in a small community named Nome. Nome was populated primarily by Yupik people, about 60%, and about 40% was white. I worked diligently to become a respected part of the community by being open to new experiences, new traditions, and new practices. With friends and community members, I began subsistence hunting, fishing, and gathering, and made myself available to help crews who needed extra help to butcher meat for their families and communities. Eventually, my hard work paid off, and in the process, I fell in love with the community, the culture, and new ideas online. Community in Nome was paramount and contradicts much of Western practices. For example, people would leave work to participate in search and rescues for individuals who were lost in the region, showing that capitalism was less important than the lives and safety of our neighbors. My first job was to run a restorative justice program called Youth Court. And since I was living in Alaska, I was able to learn from the Inupiaq people about tribal justice systems, which both informally and formally practice the circle process. This process was an invitation to join into conversation, to learn from one another, and understand how to better support one another. The underpinning theme of the circle process was that we are all interconnected. After 2 years working with Youth Court, I entered into the criminal justice system as a juvenile probation officer. I did this work in the criminal justice system for more than 7 years, but struggled with the retributive justice process. One reason I struggled was that the retributive process lacked acknowledgement of the relationships that we learned. I thought that coming to BU would allow me the opportunity to approach criminal justice from a different standpoint. It was my hope to step away from the retributive side of things and step into a more restorative or repetitive type of job. After spending my first year and a half at BU pursuing this side of things, I came to realize that my former career had harmed not only the people I worked with, my coworkers, and the people I supervised, but me as well. Since then, I've continued to embrace the RCT program, but from a different standpoint. I began to explore my passions, including Native American ministries, as well as work in public school system. The RCT program has enriched my vocational direction by first showing me what was part of my past, and then by pointing me in the direction of what gives me light and life. My papers for school have concentrated on viewing theology through the lens of Native American peoples, with a focus on land rights, the impact missionaries have had on Native Americans, Native American mascots, voter suppression, and more. I'm particularly proud of my paper for Theologies of Liberation, entitled Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, A Theology for Action. My paper acknowledged the high rates of violence, which are interlaced issues of racially motivated hate crimes and complicated jurisdictional oversight process to prosecute perpetrators that stems from back to colonization. I argued that the mistreatment of Indigenous women is sinful, immoral, and a violation of the bodies of Indigenous women. In order to begin to break this cycle of sin, these women's bodies must be located and returned home. I presented a United Methodist Church resolution to bring awareness to this national crisis. The paper felt like a true coming together of my ideas, Native American grassroots efforts, and my theology. In June 2021, the resolution went before the New England Annual Conference, a conference within the United Methodist Church, as Resolution 207, honoring missing and murdered Indigenous women, and overwhelmingly passed. The resolution asked members of the conference to cease using language around Columbus Day, and they advocate for national and state recognition of Indigenous Peoples Day. Oh, and that they wear the color red on May 5th, which is the National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. Red is the only color that spirits can see. Throughout the year, I have periodically reminded members of the conference that they agreed to this resolution and have invited them to support it through specific actions. So by focusing my studies on Native Americans, I have learned that for generations, natives have lived, survived, and shown resilience in the face of the oppressor. Throughout researching for papers, I explored so many areas where the government and or the church has harmed, wronged, and ethnically cleansed natives as a people. But through it all, natives continue to remain a strong and hopeful group. After graduation, I plan to continue working with Native American ministries through the United Methodist Church. And one area that I personally need to work on is to continue to find hope within devastating situations. I find that the people I learn from and talk to in the Native community have this hope, but I struggle to find it. I frequently think to myself that I want to look at the government and church and say, aren't you ashamed? I'm emotional. The truth is that they may be, or they may not be. But through conflict resolution, it's important, conflict resolution and conflict transformation, it's important to move past that need for others to express their guilt in the matter, and I want to keep working on finding hope in the darkness. I also plan to work as a social worker in a high school after graduation, and I will likely be doing clinical work and plan to implement the circle process into those areas. Introducing restorative justice to the students through the circle process will allow students to be able to practice actively listening, waiting their turn, and responding to conflicts. And they will leave high school with an understanding of how to address and deal with conflicts. Being at BU has given me the tools necessary to resolve personal conflict, to intervene in others' conflict, and to recognize that communal conflict needs to be acknowledged, usually by the persons or institution causing harm. It has also instilled in me that learning about conflict transformation is a never-ending process. I have only scraped the surface while studying at BU, and know that I need to be open to continued education regarding conflict, while at the same time leaning into the foundational frameworks that the program has taught me.
I'm so curious, so was your experience at Nome something that drew you to learning more about this designated murder conditions within? Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about that story, or you don't have to, it's hard.
Yeah, so my personal experience was when I went to Nome, there was a woman who had recently been murdered about a year before I showed up, and they were in the process of having the trial for the man who had killed Sonia Ivanov. And he was a police officer in Nome. He killed her while he was on duty. He was a white man, and he participated in the search for her, and he's the one who found her. So it was a very difficult process for the community to go through, and I think it's been about 16 years since that happened, and there's still no confidence in the police force in Nome. So there are a lot of problems. And that's only one instance.
Because this is a United Methodist New England resolution, what are some ways in which you would like to see churches be more involved in Native American ministries, or how can they do more things to help out?
United Methodist Church. The United Methodist Church already has a special Sunday that acknowledges Native American ministries, and so one of the things would be nice if churches actually participated in that Sunday, because I think that would automatically kind of bring in that tie. And also, I think United Methodist churches could do a good job of reaching out to their local tribes and find out more about the history, and as well as where their physical church is located and whose land that is on. So there's some pretty easy resources to use in those things.
This theme of interconnectedness has come through in a number of the presentations this morning too. The Rio Grande and some of Thomas's work, and I'm curious what the kind of interconnectedness you've seen among Indigenous communities, and that disconnect we often have in majority white community, and you're sense of navigating between those two systems and encouraging more even interconnectedness between the two.
Yeah, I think that's really challenging. You know, when I step into like a Native community, you just feel how everyone is so supportive and supportive of one another. And when I step out of that, and you know, especially when I moved back to the lower 48, it just felt like I was just in isolation. So for me, actually, STH served as a really nice little bubble of like community that provided a little bit of that community and support that I felt when I was in Alaska. But yeah, crossing those boundaries and recognizing that one of the reasons Native peoples are so resilient is because of their interconnectedness with one another, and that as white individuals, we could really learn a lot from that, and our community could be strengthened if we included some of those practices.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Beth St. John, and I just graduated this past December, and I'm finishing up the RCT certificate. I come very humbly to RCT. I resonated with Cindy and Thomas's story of meeting either Dr. Porter or Dr. Olson, but I had a little bit of a different experience. I met Tom Porter my very first time coming to STH. It was for the fall orientation, and then there was a kind of a cocktail hour mixer afterward, and there was no proselytizing, there was no flyer. I think he looked at my dazed and confused face and was like, she's got enough on her plate. And I didn't even know that I would, I didn't know anything about the Religion and Conflict Transformation program, and I didn't really have plans to go into that. But my lovely friend Tori, who is going to be speaking in a few moments, she just kind of assumed that I was because we were in a lot of other classes together. So she would say, "Aren't you going to this event?" And I said, "Well, I'm not really in the program." "Oh, it's something you would like, I think." So I was kind of pulled into it, but I'm very glad that I was. So the first class I took was Bishop Kessinger and Dr. Teddy's course, Dismantling White Power, White Privilege and Power. And my journey has very much been one of personal transformation within community. And starting with that course, and I took Spirit and Art later, but I started learning in that course how avoidant to conflict I am, and that was kind of why when Tori was like, conflict transformation, you can do this, and I was like, that's not me. I remember reading Debbie Irving's book, Waking Up White in Dismantling, and realizing I was kind of waking up at the same time, realizing how problematic whiteness can be, and developing those lenses of awareness of seeing my privilege and seeing the disparities in power, and starting to develop listening skills and questioning skills to and just the courage to confront power and privilege in my own life, and reflect on that, and to start developing skills. I was so transformed by the fact that that class was a circle style, and I remember Bishop Kessinger saying that she had helped the United Methodist Church change their meetings from Robert Rules of Order to circle process. And that was really transformative for me, as you will see in my future, or as I progress in my journey. I took Spirit and Art, Conflict Transformation, and Theology and Trauma at the same time. And these both, well, starting with Spirit and Art, it was extremely transformative for me to really realize my conflict, to do the conflict assessment and realize how conflict avoidant I am, to kind of come to grips with that. And then I loved a lot of Tom Porter's images and theological grounding that kind of gave me that's a lot of what I take with me, are those stories and metaphors that, like the walling in of our feelings and walling out conflict, and instead creating a well where we can all come together and learn from one another. And also Tom Porter's theological beliefs of interconnection and interdependence that we've been talking about, and the idea of shalom and well-being, right relations, and that God is calling all of us to be reconcilers. And I remember doing an exercise in that class, Ground Yourself in the Extraordinary, from Ron Cravel's book, Transforming the Healer. And I remember sitting in my room and doing this exercise of looking around. And I just remember this very powerful moment of feeling a deep sense of love rush through me as I looked around the room and I realized that everything, the pictures in my room, the books, they were made by God's beloved children, and that the Spirit is around us at all times. And Cravel talks a lot about the role of a catalyst and the value of imagination, as does Mary Elizabeth Moore, that we also read in that class. And so those were also very instrumental in realizing my own ability to engage in this type of work. With theology and trauma, that course gave me the opportunity to engage with a real-life nonprofit that was doing the kind of work that I was interested in. We worked with the Roxbury Presbyterian Church that has a Can We Talk program, which is just that, people coming together and remaining and abiding with one another as they share their stories. And so again, that was a very enlightening experience of realizing that, realizing where I might be drawn to this work. And so since graduation, I have decided that to become a member in discernment with the United Church of Christ. And I am now church council chair, which I had my first meeting Wednesday night. And again, that was a position that I was kind of pulled into, nudged by the Spirit. But I did feel as though I have some of the skills from RCT and Theology and Trauma, and just now to help guide me as I go forth on this field.
I think that the image of catalyst for me was very, very strong as well during the program. And I remember this video that Dr. Wilson shared about how can we see conflict or be witness of conflict, and instead of giving back conflict, that we can do, right? What is the work of transformation that we can do?
What was the last part of your question?
No, I mean, when you talk about catalysts, how do you see it?
Yeah, so, I think for me, I started this by saying that I come to this very humbly, and I feel like relationships are really like the catalyst, I feel like, for, like, in terms of my own faith community, I feel like the only way that my faith community has a lot of historical conflict and trauma, and I feel like deepening our relationships is really kind of the catalyst, I think, that is going to help us heal. And I mentioned Bishop Hassinger changing from Robert Rules of Order to helping the church change from Robert Rules of Order to circle process, because that's kind of what I'm trying to do in church council. And I feel like the prep work for that, it needs to be grounded in relationship. Does that answer your question?
I like the this notion of call in your work, right? That there are these ways that, like, you know, we're bringing ourselves and our experiences and our passion and our intention, and then there's this other thing, right? That ends up bringing us to places that we may not have imagined. And I think that's part of this work too, is like leaving open some of those spaces for that which we may not know yet, right? Or that there's something kind of drawing us into these spaces. I don't know if you want to say more about kind of the role of call in this work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I said before, I probably wouldn't be here. I felt called to ministry in the summer of 2018, and by fall I was in seminary, and so it's been a very because I felt called. My sense of call was really strong to go into ministry, and I feel like it has made me. It's given me the courage to engage in a lot of self-reflection and a lot of relational work that I probably would never have done had I not felt that kind of spiritual sense, deep spiritual sense of you can do this. This is the path that you should be on.
I'm Glenn McLaughlin. So good to see all of you. I feel like I'm surrounded by people that I've been on a journey with for a long time. So it's been so wonderful to hear all these things that all of you have said, and then to like resonate with you and see you as a person too. So I came to this program from a place of a lot of pain. I started at PU in the fall of 2019 after 3 very long years and 2 very bad jobs, and so I came to this program in a lot of pain. I had experienced conflict that pointed to me as the problem and told me to go to therapy and deal with it. Which I did, and it helped. And then my therapist was like, "You should quit your job," and I was like, "I agree with you." And so I came to this program with the intent of wanting to prevent pain for others. I didn't want anybody else to have to experience things like Laura talked about with NGOs. Yep, the church is like that too, and both of those horrible jobs were in churches. And I wanted to develop the strategies to better understand how to keep that from happening for other people. So my very first semester, I had the pleasure of walking into a class with Bishop Susan Hassinger. It was practicing faith, and it was on leadership, and pretty early on, we were assigned the book Generation to Generation by Edwin Friedman, and I was exposed to systems theory for the first time. And I just remember thinking, like, as I was reading this book, like, this is the proof that I'm not the problem. Like, this is the proof that, like, this is a systems problem. This is a problem with the way that we are told that ministry is supposed to work. And so that was like the beginning of a huge journey for me, that I started thinking about systems and how families are systems and relationships are systems and the government is a system and all of these different things. And in a lot of ways, we can view all of them as things that are interconnected to each other and then cause conflict, because what we do always affects someone else somehow. And so thinking about that from a personal level, and then also taking that and thinking about it in jobs and in churches and in families, and I just felt really inspired to try and understand, how do I take that knowledge and prevent pain? How do I teach people that, like, what you do affects other people? Because I think on some level, we all know that, but we don't think about it in the way of seeing someone in pain and thinking, how did they get there? We just see someone in pain and then try to fix it. It's the idea of the social worker who sees people falling into a river and people keep pulling them out. And they're like, why don't we go up the river and see what keeps pushing them in? That is how I feel about systems theory. I feel like we're all participating in this way of the world that is really painful, and we've been treating pain instead of preventing it. And so another course that was really transformative for me was I took Psychodynamics of Marriage and Family with Dr. Stephen Sandage, and I kind of laughed to myself because I was like, oh, marriage and family, like, I'm going to seminary to get my MRS degree, like people used to say when I was in very conservative. Did you just get that? Because in my undergrad, which was a very conservative college in Indiana, literally people would say that they came to college with no intent of ever using their degree, just finding a husband. But that course, in a lot of ways, because we read all these books and we actually read Generation to Generation again, and it was assigned to me again in Dean Hill's class this semester. It's like there's a theme here. And so I felt like that class just taught me more and more and more about how, everything in families, you have a person who shows up depressed, or something's going on, or they're misbehaving in school, or whatever, and you can't just look at that kid and think the kid is a problem. You have to look at the family and say, how do we make this whole family work together better? And because I love therapy, I took that class and then said to my partner, let's do couples therapy. And we did, and it's great. Please do it, it's great. But I just think about all the ways that these things can be applied beyond the family system and beyond couples. How do we use this within the church? And so that is what I've spent the last 3 years thinking about. And I took my contextual ed, and I'm going to say this fast because I know I don't have that much time. I took my contextual ed and created a curriculum for conflict communication. And I had the opportunity, because the people at Marsh let me do whatever I want, I had the opportunity to teach it to the senior staff at Marsh, and then also to a group of undergrads over the course of 2 different sessions. And both groups, it was like brand new information. This idea that, like, when something's going wrong, it maybe has nothing to do with you, and it may have nothing to do with them, but until you start asking questions, you don't know that. And so a huge part of systems theory is just getting people to be curious enough to ask where the system went wrong. And for undergrads, it was amazing because they're like, there's no conflict in the world, everything is great. But they have a deep understanding of internal conflict. And they wanted to know how to be better at being wrong so that conflict wouldn't be so difficult. Because the reason that conflict is so hard is because all of us are too ashamed to be wrong. And so I got to do this really amazing work trying to answer their questions. And now going forward, I'm just thinking about listening to people's questions and then trying to help people be in less pain and be approached by less pain. Yeah, so that's what I'm working on. That's what I'm hoping to do in the future. Right now, it's looking like that's probably going to end up being. I'm probably going to end up being a therapist. You know, I keep saying I'm not going to, but I think that's where it's going. So, yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. This was very lovely. I think your presentation kind of speaks on the theme of interconnectedness that has kind of been the through line throughout this morning. But I also hear themes of shame, of like you kind of feeling shame in your job and like you're the problem, or like if you're doing something wrong, like that kind of thing. So I didn't know if you had more thoughts about how like shame as a kind of tool to like keep people in modes of conflict and the larger system kind of thing.
Well, to invoke our Lord and Savior, Brene Brown again, in thinking about conflict, I always tell people the goal of communication is to put both of you on the same side looking at the conflict instead of being the conflict. Because we're all on the same team. On some level, we all want the same thing. And so by being able to take the problem of blame out of it, you eliminate the possibility for a lot of shame. Because if you're on the same team trying to solve a problem between the two of you that actually maybe has nothing to do with either of you, then you have the opportunity to stop trying to blame each other and just say, how do we repair this? And we don't have to blame someone, and therefore you don't have to hold the shame of it either.
Just off of that, just like a reflection that really reminds me of what Oscar was talking about earlier of reconciling among the people who are at the bottom, right, and then looking to the system that is oppressing and overthrowing it, right? So thank you for your presentation.
Yeah.
It's an unfair question.
Okay.
Curious about your thoughts on like the power of an individual to change a correct system versus like the way that a system shapes us to be a particular way.
That's a great question. So the biggest thing that I've taken away and the biggest way that I feel like an individual can change a system is by recognizing that they're within a system. And so I'll just use the church as an example. Like when you work within a church, yes, the church as a whole is something, but I can step back and look at it and say, okay, where do I fit into this? And where has my movement within this system caused problems, and how do I shift that? And then being able to look at other people and see the ways in which they're over-functioning or under-functioning or creating triangles or doing all these different things. And how can I not participate in that? And by refusing to participate in those really destructive things, you prevent some of them over time. It's not perfect, you're not going to fix it as one person, but any amount of minimization, I think, is crucial.
I just want to say thank you to Chloe. I relate a lot to your story about like feeling like the problem, especially in church context, which kind of leads me into like what I was going to talk about. So I'm talking about the conflict with evangelicals, and that might be a term you've heard of or not. But so evangelicals, it's not like a denomination, it's more of a kind of a category. I don't know how to explain it, so I hope you know what I'm talking about. So I grew up in very conservative Christian circles in Massachusetts, which is like relatively small, and I was not aware of how conservative my upbringing was until I got here. And because in those circles, I was the liberal one, and I thought I was like doing things right, and I got here and I felt like a fish out of water. Like I was embarrassed to not know these terms that people were like discussing at length. Like I had never heard of liberation theology, but I didn't tell people I didn't know that. I just did it. Yes, of course. So I wanted to talk about this because it's something that is really important in my journey at STH. I would no longer identify as an evangelical. I'd be an ex-evangelical, which is like a trendy term on social media, mostly for people who have left the evangelical church. And it is largely like quote unquote youth, but I guess I'm not really a youth. I'm a millennial. So it's kind of a range, but I just use youth as an easy way of talking about it. So I wanted to write my paper about so what can we do about this conflict? Like so many people who feel similarly to me have left the church because of problems with it, like the politics, the alignment with the conservative right, also like LGBTQ issues, like the rejection of that theologically, those things. Like I just, after a while, I couldn't stand it anymore, and I had to just step away from it. But it wasn't easy. Like my family definitely sees me a little bit like a lost sheep, if you will. So is it possible for the church to reconcile with these people? The answer is I don't know. I wrestled with writing this paper because I didn't know if I wanted that. Like, is the evangelical church as it is right now something that I want to repair? Because all the things that I have problems with it, like white supremacy, like biblical literalism, all of that, I'm not sure it would be evangelicalism anymore if those things didn't exist. So, yeah. Basically, it's all a big question mark, but I thought, if we were to reconcile, how might that happen? And I really focused my recommendations to the local church, and what I mean by that is just individual churches. A lot of times when we talk about the church, we're talking about the church with a capital C, and I don't think that's always the most helpful thing to talk about the church in the abstract. Because especially with conflict transformation, it's all about relationships and connections with each other. And so when we're talking about the great church, it's kind of hard to repair that harm. We're just talking about big swaths of people. So I kind of broke down my recommendations into a few large categories. And the first category was we have to let go of this lost sheep narrative, which I already touched on. The biggest problem with that is that it implies that those who have left are the problem versus the institution, right? If a church is to go into something I am not a fallen away sinner or something like that. People aren't projects, right? And I think it was Ron Graybill who talks about we have to leave room for imagination. So we can't come into any sort of process hoping for a specific outcome. We really have to be ready for imagining a new thing. And I think that goes back to my I don't know if I want to fix this version of the church. Really, we should be making something new that can be inclusive of all these different kinds of theology and different kinds of people. Another category was transform the language. If you look up articles about ex-evangelicals on things like Christianity Today, it's amazing the kind of language they will talk about those people, very, very harsh. And I just couldn't believe the things I read, and there's videos online say, and it's just so condemning, right? Because when you say somebody's not saved, they're not a Christian anymore, like in evangelical circles, that means they're going to hell. Like it's not just a simple, like you're not part of us anymore. So it has real implications. And I talk about like getting rid of that us versus them mentality for sure. Another big part of the paper was to stop minimizing the pain. Like it is legitimate trauma. I also did my MSW, and in the world of therapy, trauma, religious trauma is like a new, relatively new phenomenon that is gaining recognition, but it's not like something like diagnosable yet. It's not in the DSM-5 or anything like that. So it's a new thing, and people kind of assume that being part of a religious community is always a pro-social thing. But we're learning that's not always the case. So we need to recognize and validate that trauma and create opportunities for people to share. Because when people share their stories, then they're humanized, right? We really need to, Dr. Rambo talks about engaging the wounds. We can't just like step over it and like, we're gonna fix things without talking about the pain and giving people an opportunity to talk about that pain. And similarly, there's a lot of trauma around like people's identities, LGBTQ and also racial identities, and the church. Something very frustrating is they try to like sidestep politics and like we're not Republican, we're not Democrat, we're just for Jesus, and like that is not true at all. And it's so frustrating because they don't want to be divisive, they want to be brothers and sisters in Christ, but like if we just ignore the politics and pretend it's not happening, then we make it worse and we just ignore people's trauma and they feel unheard. So my final thing was that we need repentance, like true repentance, and we need justice before we can even think about coming together. And I think repentance needs to happen on like an interpersonal scale. Like you need to say, I did this and I'm sorry for the harm that I caused you. Like to a specific person, not just like, oh, I'm sorry the church is this way. Like really taking ownership at the local level of what has happened in that body or congregation. There needs to be a spirit of empathy, and that's empathy and humility, and that's, I think, where progress will be made. And also, at the same time, we can't just say, like, the church is the problem. We need to recognize that there is a blurred line between victim and perpetrator. Before I came here, I was a youth pastor at a very evangelical church, and, like, I cringe when I think about things that I used to teach the kids there, because those things were harmful to me and I taught them.
This is not a question, it's more of a comment. I think that it takes a lot of courage to walk away from something that you recognize is not nourishing to the learner or is harm. Especially when it comes with like in a community setting or a familia or a family, as a part of a family circle. So I just want to say.
So, thank you so much. Where do you stand, or what are your thoughts about where these evangelicals, which I would say I'm one of them, where should they be? I mean, going back to the church is maybe not an option. Reconciling with the church, okay, but not going back, or create their own new churches, or looking for a different, more progressive denomination. I mean, or maybe in your own experience, what do you think is like the better?
I don't know if I can give you an answer to that, because I'm figuring that out myself. Like I don't currently attend the church, because I think it would be very easy to slip back into like the way that we do church if I went to any kind of like institution. Like something I would like for myself is to like create a community of people who identify as evangelical, if you will, and like kind of more like a home church, just like meet in someone's living room kind of thing. Because I actually think that's what the church is really supposed to be, more than like a building or like a denomination. So just like a community is what I'm personally looking for. But I think it's very individual to everybody, like whether they want to go to a formal church or start something new or whatever.
I just wanted to share thanks. I excerpted part of your paper and sent it to a good friend of mine who has a similar story to yours, and she really resonated with what you shared, and she sends her thanks. But also to say that I think some of the most creative faith communities that are happening right now are in the evangelical community, my friend being one of them. And I think that I am so glad to hear you have the hopeful vision for yourself and creating spiritual community, because I come from like the opposite side of the world in church polity, being Roman Catholic. But it's beautiful to watch us millennials, and especially the evangelical millennials, try to forge a new path and be really authentic and really transformative in what you all are doing. So I've seen this with a lot of my good friends, and I'm sending you hope and prayer, because I know the power you all have and the expertise you already brought to bear on this topic. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I'd love to connect with you.
I'm happy to send it her your way.
Hello everyone, my name is Tori Rizaki, and I'm going to be talking about a theory and theology of relationship. I know I'll be maybe drawing on a lot of the things that people have shared. As I looked over my work for this class, and really my work throughout seminary has been really focused on relationship. I come from the Unitarian Universalist faith tradition, which is a covenantal faith. I came to this faith later in my life, and it was so deeply transformative to be in a community that covenanted with each other and honored each other as the relationship was the foundation. So I'll say a little bit more about that as I go through. So I'm interested in looking at relationships as they work interpersonally, but also as they relate to institutions and the larger social system. So how our personal relationships relate to our institutions and our larger culture. One of the images that really stood out for me early on in this program in Tom Porter's book was this image of the well, which Beth had mentioned too, but this notion of creating a communal well for healing and transformation, one that we give into. We provide our own life-giving water into this well, but it's also a well that we do need to draw on sometimes, right? So there's this real relational process for me to this image of a well. It's both individual and it's also collective and social. And as I think, as I look back over my coursework, some of my questions around relationships were really around how do they function, how do they create conflict, but also how are they the catalyst that helps us move through conflict? How might we cultivate deeper relationships in our faith communities? And how might this nurture this idea of a collective well? I have always believed that our larger culture doesn't give us many chances to practice being in right relationship to each other. So coming into a faith community gives us an opportunity to practice this. And then we take what we learn out into the wider world. And so there's this interplay there of tremendous possibility and transformation, but also a lot of challenge too. So I'll just kind of go through some of my points of resonance. In theology and trauma, I was really interested in how relationships functioned and how we understand suffering in the world, both as how we experience it, but also as how we perpetrate it. Mira Rivera's work on relational transcendence was so huge here, and also immigration theologies, this idea that difference is essential, right? We have to be our own people, and we need to be able to encounter others in their difference as a way to resist this urge that we all have to assimilation or appropriation or bringing someone over to our side, that there's something really powerful in encountering another person in their fullness and in everything that they are. And also the importance of storytelling, of testimony and witness within our own individual relationships and our larger institutions, that really is this doorway to transformation. In Paradigms of Racism and Ignorance, we did a lot of practicing of empathy. We worked in dyads and the larger group to develop this kind of practical tool of engaging empathetically. And one of the really profound and maybe very simple realizations for me around empathy practice is that I am not the judge of my own ability to be empathetic. That the person that I am in relationship with needs to feel understood. And that really opened up for me on an interpersonal level this instinct to ask more questions in the company of other people. Not so much did I understand them, but did they feel understood by me? And I think that, again, like a lot of these conversations about relationships, this happens interpersonally, but I think it also happens on an institutional and a larger social level as we're, in relationship with some of these big challenges that we're facing. In Spirit and the Art of Conflict Transformation, I engaged a little bit more with my own faith community, Unitarian Universalism. This denomination holds a lot of space for a variety of beliefs, and being able to engage across difference is essential, but it's also fraught. It's a fraught landscape. Our denomination is recently reckoning with working to dismantle white supremacy culture within our institution. So even as justice-oriented as we like to think we are, we too have these issues, and they come up in trying to live out a multicultural faith that is trying to do good work in the world, that relationships can be both life-giving, but they can also be life-denying. I was really drawn to John Politoroff's work on relationships over solutions, right? That, again, the relationships are so important. And they allow us to be responsive, reflexive, and adaptive. So as our communities change and our communities diversify and grow, we have to be able to change and grow too. And so relationships offer us some of that dynamic possibility for transformation. And then also, I want to just also make a nod to the importance of spirituality here. I come from the nonprofit world, which does not have this kind of spiritual, theological focus. In liberation theologies, I explored the relationship between spirituality and liberation. So again, I think there's a real importance here that faith